On January 30th, 2026, the United States Department of Justice broke a federal law. Not quietly, not accidentally. They did it in public, held a press conference, and declared themselves in full compliance. This isn't about Jeffrey Epstein anymore. This is about what happens when the people who enforce the law decide deadlines don't apply to them. Right now, the entire conversation is focused on who appears in the Epstein files. Trump, Clinton, Elon Musk, business leaders, foreign diplomats. That's the distraction. The real story is about power, timing, and control. Here's what nobody is telling you. The Epstein Files Transparency Act wasn't a suggestion. It was federal law. Signed by President Trump on November 19, 2025, passed 427-1 in the House, unanimous in the Senate. The law gave the Attorney General 30 days to release all unclassified files related to the Epstein and Maxwell investigations. That deadline was December 19, 2025. By that date, the DOJ had released roughly 12,000 documents, less than 1% of what federal law required. Then, 2 months late, on a Friday afternoon at 4 p.m., they dumped 3 million pages and declared victory. And here's why this matters to you. If a federal agency can ignore a law passed with near-unanimous support, this precedent applies to every transparency law that affects your taxes, your surveillance, and your rights. This isn't about Epstein. This is about whether statutory deadlines still mean anything. Let's walk through what actually happened, step by step, because the timeline doesn't just reveal delays, it reveals strategy. November 19, 2025. President Trump signs the Epstein Files Transparency Act into law. The clock starts. 30 days to release all files. The law is clear. The deadline is non-negotiable. December 19, 2025. The legal deadline arrives. The DOJ releases a small fraction of the files, roughly 12,000 documents out of what they later acknowledge as 6 million potentially responsive pages. That's less than 1% compliance with a federal statute. Bipartisan members of Congress immediately accused the Justice Department of violating the very law the president signed. Democratic and Republican lawmakers demand answers. The DOJ says the files are coming. They cite the volume. They cite victim privacy protections. They cite the need for careful review. But they don't release the files. December 20 through 23, 2025. 16 files mysteriously disappear from the public DOJ webpage. No explanation given. Congressional members from both parties demand to know what happened. The DOJ doesn't respond. Early January 2026. Less than 1% of files have been released. A DOJ letter to Congress confirms this. Public polling shows 91% of Democrats, 78% of independents, and 74% of Republicans support full release. Approval of Trump's handling of the investigation sits at 26%. This isn't a partisan issue. This is institutional failure in real time. January 21, 2026. Democratic Representative Summer Lee introduces an amendment to hold Attorney General Pam Bondi in contempt of Congress for failing to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The amendment fails along party lines, 19-24. The precedent is set. Statutory deadlines are now negotiable if you control enough votes. January 30, 2026. late Friday afternoon. The DOJ releases 3.5 million pages total, including 2,000 videos and 180,000 images. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche holds a press conference. He announces this is the final release. He declares the department in full compliance with the law. Now watch what happens next. Within hours, journalists discover faulty redaction techniques. Users recover fully redacted files by manipulating the digital documents. The recovered portions don't just contain victim information. They contain investigative findings, FBI tips, and details about Epstein's network that were never supposed to be hidden. Within 48 hours, Congressional Democrats, led by Representative Ro Khanna, point out that the DOJ identified 6 million potentially responsive pages, but only released 3.5 million. They demand to know why half the files are being withheld. That's not a timeline. That's a legal strategy unfolding in real time. From a prosecutor's perspective, this isn't complicated. When someone is legally required to produce documents by a certain date and they miss that deadline, you ask 3 questions. 1. Did they have the documents? Yes. The DOJ acknowledged possessing 6 million potentially responsive pages before the deadline. 2. Did they have the resources to review and release them? According to Deputy AG Blanche, over 500 DOJ attorneys and reviewers worked on this effort. They had the resources. They had 2 months before the deadline. They chose not to meet it. 3. What changed between the deadline and when they finally produced the documents? This is where it gets interesting. Between December 19 and January 30th, several things happened. Congressional pressure intensified. A contempt motion was introduced. Public polling showed overwhelming disapproval across party lines. News outlets began investigating the missing files and faulty redactions. Then the DOJ released everything on a Friday afternoon. The classic timing for document dumps designed to minimize media coverage. But here's what prosecutors look for: the content of what was withheld and when it became public. The files include mentions of Trump, but the DOJ's own statement describes some of these as untrue and sensationalist claims submitted right before the 2020 election. The department went out of its way to say politicians and notable individuals were not redacted from the release. Yet half the collected files remain unreleased. The DOJ says this is due to duplicates, unrelated materials, and victim protections. Congressional members aren't buying it. From a legal standpoint, the question becomes this: did the DOJ violate the Epstein Files Transparency Act? If so, what's the remedy? And if not, why did it take a contempt threat to force compliance? Here's the leverage. The Act contains exceptions for victim privacy and ongoing investigations. But it does not provide an exception for inconvenient timing or political sensitivity. When an agency designed to enforce the law operates outside it, the entire system of accountability breaks down. Here's what they're not telling you. This isn't about one investigation. This is about precedent. If the Department of Justice can miss a statutory deadline by 2 months, claim compliance after releasing only half the required material, and face no consequences beyond failed contempt votes along party lines, what does that signal to every other federal agency? What does it signal to Congress? What does it signal to you? The Epstein Files Transparency Act was one of the rare pieces of legislation to receive near-unanimous support. It passed because the public, regardless of political affiliation, demanded accountability. It passed because transparency around the Epstein investigation wasn't partisan. It was universal. But the execution revealed something else: institutional resistance. The DOJ's internal review, released earlier in 2025, found no client list among the evidence. Attorney General Pam Bondi stated in February 2025 that such a list was sitting on my desk right now to review. By July, the department announced no incriminating client list existed, yet the public pressure never subsided. Polling consistently showed that Americans across party lines believed the government was withholding information. By January 2026, nearly half of Republicans, 3/4 of independents, and 90% of Democrats said the same thing. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a crisis of institutional trust. And when the DOJ finally released the bulk of the files, they did so with a statement emphasizing that some claims about Trump were false and unfounded. That's a political framing of a legal release. It signals concern not just about victim privacy, but about narrative control. Here's the hidden dynamic. Every day these files remained unreleased was a day the executive branch controlled the story. Once released, the files become public property. Journalists analyze them. Researchers comb through them. The narrative fractures into 1,000 pieces. Delaying the release delayed that fracturing. The question prosecutors ask is this: who benefited from the delay? And what would have happened if the files had been released on December 19th, as required? This has implications far beyond Jeffrey Epstein. When the Justice Department, the institution responsible for enforcing federal statutes, fails to comply with a federal statute, it creates a paradox. Who enforces the law on the enforcers? Congress attempted to through contempt motions. Those motions failed along party lines. The precedent is now set. Statutory deadlines are negotiable if you control enough votes. The House Oversight Committee issued a separate subpoena to Attorney General Bondi for unredacted files. That subpoena has not been fulfilled. The committee also summoned Bill and Hillary Clinton to testify about their appearances in the files. The Clintons refused, calling the subpoena legally invalid. The committee voted to hold Bill Clinton in contempt 34-8, with 9 Democrats joining Republicans. The vote on Hillary Clinton was 28-15. This creates competing contempt claims. Congress accusing the DOJ of contempt for missing the statutory deadline, and Congress holding private citizens in contempt for refusing subpoenas. The question becomes this: does congressional oversight still function when the executive branch delays compliance and private citizens refuse cooperation? The DOJ is supposed to operate independently from political pressure. But when the president who signed the transparency law is also mentioned in the files, and when the DOJ delays release until after congressional threats, the appearance of political influence becomes unavoidable. Deputy AG Blanche stated explicitly that there was no White House oversight of the release and no effort to protect Trump. But the timing creates the opposite impression. A Friday afternoon dump 2 months late with a statement emphasizing false claims about the president. Perception matters in law. When institutions lose public trust, they lose legitimacy. A January 2026 CNN poll found that only 6% of Americans were satisfied with what the federal government had released so far. That's not a partisan divide. That's institutional failure. So where does this go? The DOJ says it's done. Deputy AG Blanche announced the January 30th release as the final production. The department claims full compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. But half the collected files remain unreleased. Congressional members are demanding explanations. Victims groups are criticizing the release for exposing some survivors' names while protecting powerful figures through strategic redactions. Journalists are recovering fully redacted files through digital manipulation. And the House Oversight Committee is preparing full votes on contempt charges for the Clintons, who refuse to testify. This moment isn't about Jeffrey Epstein's crimes. Those are documented. This moment is about what happens when transparency laws meet executive power, and when the agency tasked with enforcing the law decides deadlines don't apply. The precedent is set. Statutory timelines are now optional. Congressional subpoenas can be ignored. Document releases can be delayed, controlled, and framed politically without consequence. Watch what happens next. Because the next transparency law, the next congressional subpoena, the next statutory deadline, they'll all be measured against this moment. And institutions don't collapse overnight. They erode. One deadline at a time. This moment matters.